Hi, I'm Florence Theriault, and I'm here to take you on a journey with me, a wonderful journey that I had, and I want you to share with me to the world of the Neapolitan doll. This is a very exciting adventure. When Umar Butkus from Vienna called Stuart about 6 months ago and said, "Stuart, I think we have decided to part with our collection of Neapolitan dolls," we were pretty amazed because we had already sold for him the Hanna Butkus collection of rare French poupées, the Hanna Butkus collection of half dolls, and other wonderful pieces. But we thought that these would never be sold because the Neapolitan doll collection was her most cherished and her last collection. But we went to see him, and Umar was a bit apprehensive about having Theriault present this auction, and to be quite frank, I was pretty apprehensive myself about undertaking this project. I wasn't sure how it fit into our whole theme, our company theme of the doll, the antique plaything. But so while Stuart was over there looking at the dolls, I was here perusing literature and reading and calling collectors and asking them what they knew about this wonderful subject. And the more I got into it, the more I said, this is really exciting. This is a whole new avenue of doll collecting. And we got excited about it, and then Mr. Butkus got excited about it, and consequently decided that we would be able to offer you this astonishing collection. We're offering it in two parts, and I'm here to talk to you today about part one that will be presented on December of 2020. And so I'm going to share some of these things with you. Before we go into showing you the individual dolls, I want to share with you some of the many things I learned about the background of the Neapolitan doll. Legend has it that the idea of a nativity scene, which is what most people tend to think of when they think of the Neapolitan dolls, but that the concept of the nativity scene began with St. Francis of Assisi 500 years before the golden age of the Neapolitan doll in 1700, 500 years earlier. It is said that St. Francis of Assisi assembled nearby a cave a live presentation, although no one moved, so it was, a frozen still of live people, using live people and live animals, including oxen and ass, and had recreated the entire vision of what the nativity scene would be. That became a kind of a popular thing to do, and the notion of it spread throughout Italy, and many people constructed similar scenes. The tradition continued. Then without the live people anymore, because sculptors began doing statues in marble and in stone, and some of them very, very notable and very important pieces of Italian art. The tradition evolved even further over time. The figures became smaller. The scenes gradually became more secular, but they were still simple and reverential. And then installations became permanent year-round. Then the 1700s golden age of Naples began. And then everything really evolved. And that is when the Neapolitan doll, as we know it today, began during the 1700s. Simple scenes became grand theater. The nativity scene was edged into a far, far corner of the scenes. Entire villages, people, animals, accessories, and backgrounds were created in order to have very interactive scenes, very scenes of livelihood and people moving and people interacting with each other, people purchasing foods in the marketplace or gathering in the taverns and enjoying an ale together, people in the farmyards pulling whatever you do with wheat. All right, okay, farmer's girl here, I don't know what you do with wheat. All right, and then making wine and serving wine, all sorts of scenes of, ironically, not life at the time of the birth of Christ, but actually life in the 1700s in Naples, Italy, because the costumes now and the buildings and the accessories were created to be in the style of the 1700s. Now these became smaller. The dolls became the size of dolls we know them. Some as small as 2 inches and others going to like 20, 22 or 23 inches. And the doll itself now changed. Dolls that had been marble or stone now became terracotta, and the entire industry changed. To me, it was so fascinating because I see so much of doll history repeated century after century with different modes of materials and in different cultures and in different ways. And in reading this and studying about these dolls and examining them, I was so fascinated to realize the way in which this doll was created. It was, let me explain it. What had been carved of marble or carved of stone was now done in an earthenware or terracotta, which to all visible eye, when you look at it, you will always think that it is carved wood. In fact, sometimes you find it almost impossible to believe that it is terracotta. But what did terracotta do? It enabled production to be greater because a model could be formed, the model could be cast. The body changed. The body now, and this is really important for people, for doll collectors to understand this, the body now became posable. And what do we want to do with our doll figures? We want to place them in scenes. We want to pose them. And as you're scanning, as we're showing you these various scenes that have been set up with figures and accessories and background from the Umer and Hammer collection, please note how the dolls are interacting. That was the whole point of it. Lively, dynamic scenes, people interacting with each other, talking with each other, as you might actually see on any busy street scene. It was important to have this new posable body. The body was formed of like a metal armature that could be bent in various shapes. So a doll could be waving, could be holding a basket, could be kneeling, could have their arm around someone, however you wish to pose the doll. Wire armature was then padded, and then it was wrapped with what is called tow, T-O-W, and actually is a form of a textured hemp or a textured twine that has not been refined. But it gave a softness to the body, so it was more like a human body rather than being metal, but it also allowed the flexibility. So now you have this wonderful doll being made with the terracotta head, the armature body, and important to notice, now it is not just one artist creating this object, but it is almost like a small industry. An artist might design the head. Someone else might form the casting for it and pour the casting for it. Another person would create the body. The painting of the head would be done by still another person. The carved, because the lower arms and legs were carved wood, would be done by still a third person. And then it needed to be assembled, and then it needed to be costumed in fine silks and cottons and jewelry and all of the other accessories that make each of these so lifelike and real. This was so fascinating to me because I had not imagined what this was like. And immediately all of the eras of doll history started going through my head, and I thought of every industry. Well, the first one that came to my mind was Paris 100 years later in the 1860s and 1870s, when the poupée, again a form of a theatrical type looking doll, a very dramatic grown people dolls usually representing grown men and women, were not dissimilar to the Neapolitan theater dolls. And that exactly was the same thing. A porcelain head might be made in one factory, a body in another. The dolls would then be assembled. The wig would be made by someone else, even the eyes. And then the costuming done in various ateliers. It was not until sometime later that some factories, such as Jumeau, took the whole thing under their roof. But mostly small specialty artists and craftsmen creating to assemble these wonderful works of art. So that was, to me, a very, very wonderful thing to discover because it related so much to what else we were doing. Now, this became such a fad. It just kind of overtook the whole ambiance of Naples at the time. It was an extraordinary industry. And how did this happen? How did these dolls that had started out as a simple little nativity scene, very crudely done, how did it blossom and flourish into this grand scene? Well, it was an 18th century fusion of historical and social events. It was a perfect storm, you might call it, of the traditional Neapolitan reverence for the arts, combined with now the extreme wealth in Naples at the time and the very competitive desire to display that wealth. So the aristocrats, they vied with each other to create the scenes and figures in their home, and they would call upon artists to design figures especially for them. One person is related as having their entire floor of one of the floors of their castle, their mansion, turned into displays of their Neapolitan figures. Not to mention that it was of great interest to the king himself. During this era, which not I, but other people have called the Golden Age of Naples, 1734 to 1805, the city soared to artistic, intellectual, and cultural apex that was rivaled only by Paris at this time. For example, in 1737, the Opera de San Carlo was built. This is considered the oldest opera theater in Italy and is revered to this day as being of extreme interest to any composer of that period, including, for example, Mozart, who traveled there at the time. He wrote about his visit to Naples during that time, which was quite interesting to him. It was also the birthplace of the popular form of musical entertainment, the comic opera. I mention all of these things because as you look at these Neapolitan dolls, you can see the influence of the opera and the opera costumes and the vivacity. I mean, you look at these scenes that we're showing you and you almost see a Mozart opera in your head if you've ever been to one. There were visits from other European artists and writers during this Golden Age period. Goethe, who wrote Faust in 1787, wrote this in his diary about his visit to Naples. "We spent today in ecstasies over the astonishing sights. One may write or paint as much as one likes, but this place, the shore, the gulf, Vesuvius, the citadels, the villas, everything defies description." And went on to say that while he was in Rome, he was able to do his studies, but when he was in Naples, it was hard to settle down. There were so many good things to do. The discovery of the Roman ruins that are so famous and visited today came about at this time. Pompeii, for example, nearby Naples, was discovered in 1748. And as you go through in both sessions of this Neapolitan collection that we'll be offering, you're going to see so many of the backgrounds that were constructed are in the form of ruins. They had definitely an impact on the presentation of art and culture at this time. There was so much interaction in Europe. 2 marriages of Neapolitan royalty at this time really had an impact on it. First of all was Maria Amelia of Saxony from her birthplace in Dresden. And she was married to the first king during this time, King Carlo, and she sponsored, for example, and really pushed the development of the Capodimonte porcelain firm in Italy. So you can see her interest in the sculpting of fine art. Someone later wrote about Carlo's reign as king and talked about the king and queen, about Carlos and Maria Amelia's interest in the Neapolitan doll, and he had this wonderful reference in his book. He wrote that the king loved to stand and watch Maria Amelia sew costumes for the dolls in her scenes, and then he added, this is the quote, it was great, "The king was amused himself in the idle hours of the day with his royal hands, molding and baking little bricks, shaping the stable, designing the background, putting the statuettes in their place." So almost like assembling one of your doll vignettes or a dollhouse or something, to make this arrangement with these people and to see in your mind imagining the stories that would accompany each of the little figures or the vignettes or scenes as you set them up. I love that. In the idle hours of the king's day with his royal hands. The peak of the Neapolitan theater doll was during the reign of Edward IV, and he married Maria Carolina of Austria, so someone else who had come into Naples and bringing her other European influence in the city. She and her ladies were very, very famous for dressing the dolls she had other great influence on the whole scene. For example, she established the St. Lucia colony, whose sole object was to weave silk that was used in the dressing of the dolls. Their fascination with the historical traditional costumes was also interesting. Both Ferdinand and Maria Carolina were fascinated by the regional costumes that still prevailed throughout Italy. And in many of these dolls, you are going to see that they're wearing these regional costumes. Ferdinand really promoted this. He encouraged the development of lithographs and engravings that would be showing the costumes, and then actually commissioned some of the artists who were creating the Neapolitan dolls. He made the order that he wanted them dressed in those regional costumes, and you will be seeing many of these. Another subject of interest that was really gaining prominence during this time was the study of ethnography, and especially interest in the Eastern world. And again, I say this because you will see that repeated over and over again as you study the various Neapolitan dolls. Dolls from the Moors, the Turkish, the Asian, and they're just wonderful. And he was quite fascinated with this and really encouraged its development and its study. So as you can see, the dolls were a very, very important part of the Neapolitan culture at the time, favored by the royal family over and over again. And true today, as always, as it was then, whatever was favored by the royal family was also favored by the aristocracy, and the trend blossomed. The golden age of the Neapolitan doll, however, lasted scarcely a century. The secular direction of this doll had begun in the late 1600s, gathered steam in the early 1700s, and finally, upon the prevalent use of terracotta, which allowed a variety of facial models, and the new armature body, which allowed posing, did the movement reach its peak. The fad fed upon itself, inspired in no little degree by the wealth of the aristocracy, the playful and extravagant atmosphere of the times, and the patronage of the royal family. A wonderful catalog was written by a 2008 museum exhibition at the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. And in that catalog introduction, scholar Elio Catello described the entire thing as, quote, a grand distraction for a population at play, a toy of the elite. Then, as fads will tend to do, it ended. The heyday was over by the early 1800s, although some lesser work continued for several decades. Some important collections are kept intact, still are today, yet many other family collections began to be dispersed at that time. It was not until the late 1800s that some few art lovers rediscovered the genre, and it was not until the mid to late 1900s, a short time ago, that serious collecting began. One of these collectors has been Hannah Bucas, and her judicious preservation of these rare dolls is a gift to history and art, and I'll be happy to share them now with you.